Welcome everybody, and thank you for tuning in to discuss the much and summary topic of corruption on a bright or bleak, depending on where you're at, July afternoon. My name is Camino Mortera-Martinez, and I'm a senior research fellow at the Center for European Reform in Brussels, where I can assure you the afternoon is very grim indeed. A couple of months ago, I wrote a paper with the very ambitious title of How to Fight Corruption and Uphold the Rule of Law. If this was 2019, I would be launching this paper in person, and I would be telling you that you can have copies of it by the entrance, by the door. But it's 2021, we've had a pandemic, we've all gone online, which I guess is not only good for you attending this seminar from the summer house or your garden or the beach, but it's also good for the environment. So if you want to read the paper, I would kindly point you at our website, www.cer.eu, where you can find it and read it should you want to. But enough with the shameless self-promotion, at least for now, because at the end of the day, this is the launch of a paper. When I decided to put together an event so that we could talk about corruption and the rule of law beyond the more academic think tanky world, I didn't want to do it alone. So I decided to call up some of the popes on this matter. And luckily for me, they have all agreed to be here with me today. I don't think any of them need any introduction, but I'm going to do it anyway, politesse oblige. First, Katalin Cseh is member of the European Parliament, Vice-Chair of the Renew Europe group, and a member of Momentum in Hungary. Katalin, as I'm sure most of you will know, has been very active on the rule of law corruption file ever since she got elected in 2019. Second, Michiel van Hulten, Director of Transparency International EU and a former MEP and EU official himself. And last but not least, Carl Dolan, previously at Transparency International too, and now Deputy Director and Head of Advocacy at the Open Society European Policy Institute, without which this paper wouldn't have been possible, as it is part of a series that the CER and the Open Society Institute are doing together on the future of EU Justice and Home Affairs policies. Now, I'm allocated 15 minutes to speak and to present the findings of my paper, which I think is an extremely long time, and I've already wasted like 3 of them talking about the weather, like any good Spaniard would. So I'm going to try to keep this sweet and short. After my introductory remarks, I will give the floor to Katalin, Michiel, and Carl, who will offer some thoughts of their own and also some reflection to the paper. And then I will open a Q&A with the audience. As per usual, if you want to ask a question, please raise your virtual hand or write it in the chat. Now the event is fully on the record and is being recorded as well. So I will start my introductory remarks by answering a very simple question. Why should we care about corruption? Well, we should care, first of all, because it's very expensive. Now, I must admit that there are no reliable data on this, depending on who one chooses to believe. Corruption reduces the GDP of the European Union by between 120 and 990 billion every year. So that's a big difference. We do know, however, that member states estimate that around 638 million of structural funds were misused, for example, in 2015. So there is some data that we can rely on. But you know, if you're not big on data and numbers, as I am not, let me offer you another reason why we should care about corruption. Corruption makes a country much less likely to grow in the short and medium term, and surely much less attractive to foreign investors. And it has been proved that where corruption is perceived as being widespread, like Cyprus, Greece, or Romania, it can act as a deterrent for the establishment of both local and foreign companies, which is something that we should all care about if we care about the quality of life in our cities the education of our children, or our country's reputation in the world, amongst other things. Perhaps the more serious risk of corruption is that it erodes the rule of law by diminishing trust in institutions and governments. And I'm going to give you some numbers to sort of support this claim. According to a recent European Parliament survey, a sizable majority of European Union citizens, so 77%, think that the European Union should only give money to those governments that respect the rule of law, including the fight against corruption. Finally, corruption can kill. And I think the families of Jan Kuciak, Martina Kusnirova, and Daphne Caruana Galizia, among others, can speak to that. If that is not a very important reason, I don't know what is. Now, why do I think that this is a very timely and a very essential discussion? The first and very obvious reason is because we are still in the middle of a pandemic. We're trying to get our economy going again, and the European Union has launched what I consider to be one of the most important developments in history, the history of the European Union, of course, which is the recovery funds. Now, one of the major risks for the recovery funds it's that it ends up in the hands of corrupt politicians and their friends. And this is not only me thinking that. There was a survey, a very timely survey published in November 2020 by the European Council on Foreign Relations that showed that 38% of citizens in Austria, Denmark, Finland, France, Germany, the Netherlands, Poland, and Sweden think that the biggest risk of the European Union's post-pandemic recovery funds is that it may be wasted or end up in the hands of corrupt politicians. These countries are, of course, important because they are the five frugals plus Poland and France. And according to the poll, waste and corruption were people's main concern, much more important for them than the recovery fund actually being really big. So that you can see how important this fund is for European Union citizens. Now, this is timely as well, because we're in the middle of the Commission approving national recovery plans. Yesterday was the deadline for the approval of Hungary's national recovery plan, which, as you may know, has not gone forward because the Commission has decided that Budapest is not fulfilling some obligations, notably related to anti-corruption plans. So it's holding 7.2 billion euros. And as opposed to the Commission's approach to Hungary, I will offer you a counterexample, which is that the Commission approved Slovenia's national recovery plan, if I'm correct, it was a couple of weeks ago, despite Slovenia not having nominated a delegated prosecutor to the European Public Prosecutor's Office. Now, why is this a big thing? The EPPO, the European Public Prosecutor's Office, is a very big thing because it's the first European Union body with powers to prosecute criminals. It is supposed to be policing the way member states, governments, politicians, but also individuals use EU funds. So it has the all-important task of monitoring the European Union's biggest budget to date, including the recovery funds, which is an enormous pot of money that was hard to agree upon and is currently at the center of a row over the European Union's values and the bloc's urgent needs to get its economy going after the pandemic. To uphold the rule of law, and in some unfortunate cases to restore it altogether, the European Union needs a very forceful anti-corruption plan. Now, the European Union is already doing stuff, and we know this. They are already passing laws. They are already helping member states set up strategies. And of course, when it comes to the rule of law, it's already engaged in Article 7 procedures against Hungary and Poland, and it has pushed forward with the conditionality mechanism that we will talk about later, even though it is suspended at the moment. Now, all these things are very good and very laudable efforts, but they are not enough, in my view. In the words of Laura Kövesi, who is the first European Union public prosecutor chief, the fight against corruption is a fight first and foremost to change mentalities. And I don't think that there is any European Union campaign that can, change chronism in rural Greece or Spain or Romania or Hungary, you name it. But there are a few things that the European Union can do. Now, I'll use the last 4 minutes of my intervention to outline 3 things that I think the European Union can do to fight corruption and uphold the rule of law. The first one is to have a well-functioning public prosecutor. Now, the main problem of the EPPO is that not all member states are members of it. Some of them are not members because of technical reasons, like, for example, Denmark or Ireland, because they have an opt-out from EU Justice and Home Affairs. Some are not members at the moment, but they hopefully will join soon, like Sweden. And some are not members because they just don't want to be all together, like Hungary and Poland. And obviously, those are the countries where problems are at the moment the most acute. One way that the European public prosecutor could actually overcome this problem is by using something called European investigation orders, which are court orders from a judicial authority in a member state to another member state asking to open proceedings or to gather evidence. Now, the EPPO will be considered or is considered a judicial authority in the European Union, so has the power to issue European investigation orders and can do so for all member states except for Denmark and Ireland, again, because of their opt-out in Justice and Home Affairs, but that includes Hungary and Poland. So this is a way that perhaps the European public prosecutor can overcome Hungary and Poland not being part of its membership at this very moment. Now, on a second time, I think that one step further should be to subject the payment of EU funds to be members of the European Public Prosecutor's Office. So very much like the rule of law conditionality mechanism, we could eventually sort of ask countries who want to benefit from EU funds to sign up to the European Public Prosecutor's Office first. And this could technically be done by a regulation, so there is no veto problems around the corner with this one. The second thing that the European Union could do is an all-encompassing anti-corruption strategy, because I don't believe that sheer regulations or sanctions alone are going to solve the problem. We need to look much beyond. We need to look further, like, for example, a fairer entrance to civil service, but also better internet connections, e-health access, and all these sort of things. But for me, perhaps the most important thing is an uncompromising defense of the judiciary. Because the judiciary is the last line of defense that the European Union rule of law based order has. And there is a reason why liberal governments have been reducing the independence of their courts. While all democratic institutions suffer when the rule of law is under threat, the judiciary tends to take the worst hits, as it has no tools to defend itself. And there can be no proper anti-corruption mechanism if there are no judges to act upon that. Now, until recently, the European Union had limited powers to do something about the judiciary when it was captured, when there were problems in member states, other than resorting to Article 7 proceedings or procedures, which have proved to be at the moment rather inefficient. But a 2018 ruling changed that. The ECJ in 2018, in a case involving the trade union of the Portuguese judiciary, ruled that any judge in the European Union should be considered an EU judge, and as such should be subject not only to sort of rule of law, if you want, standards, but also to internal market standards and to the obligation of effective administration of justice. So the European Union, the European Court of Justice found that the European Union was competent to actually rule over things like disciplinary proceedings and things like that, which some governments, and we are seeing that Poland is going to issue a very important ruling today about that. Some governments, as I was saying, were using a sort of backdoor mechanism to capture the judiciary through disciplinary proceedings or internal laws or these kind of things. Now the European Union, thanks to this ECJ ruling, has more powers, and it should be using them more forcefully, to defend the judiciary. The third and last thing the European Union could do is to have a better anti-corruption supervision, and that involves joining the Council of Europe's group of states against corruption, GRECO, also making better use of the European semester process, because corruption is not only a question of values, rule of law, and sort of like criminal law, if you want, but it's also a question of the economy and the internal market. So it should fall squarely and much more clearly within the European semester process. Linked to that, the European Union could also upgrade the role of banking supervision to prevent money laundering scandals like we have had in the past. And then we will have a discussion on whether or not this should be done through the European Banking Authority or through a new agency or a new body. And finally, the rule of law revision mechanism. That's a very big topic, perhaps for another event, but perhaps a way forward would be to use Article 70 of the Treaty of Lisbon, to use a peer review from member states to sort of like understand and act upon systemic problems before they become a Poland or a Hungary size issue. Let me finish by saying that I believe that defending the rule of law might be the European Union's most pressing and most difficult task over the coming years. The European Union will not succeed in stopping governments from capturing the judiciaries, creating LGBTQI+ free zones, or weakening their parliaments by sheer regulatory force alone. Nor would sanctions ever be 100% effective, because they tend to affect citizens more than they do governments. To uphold the rule of law, the European Union needs a broad strategy that includes credible and enforceable anti-corruption measures. And as my paper, that I'm sure you will have all read or will read soon, concludes, for the European Union and its member states, the need to support a rules-based international order, an order that the European Union itself is based upon, is existential. So on that note, and sorry for having run my time a little bit, I like to give the floor to my panelists, and thank you very much again for having been here, for being here and for patiently listening to my rantings about corruption. Katalin, you're first.
Thank you very much. And first of all, let me thank you for the invitation and also for this extremely exciting and timely paper. Well, as you mentioned in the introduction, ever since I got elected, I was trying to work on a project which basically entails tying our European money to our European values. And let me pick up where you left it. I believe that we have to do it not only because this is the right thing and because it's the responsible thing, but this is the issue which will determine whether the European Union will be a strong global player in the future or will continue on the path of disintegration and will become a loosely tied economic union, as some of our member states right now advocate. If we cannot become a community of values, which we were supposed to be, then the most basic and most fundamental challenges will persist, and the differences between the experiences of people, European citizens living at different parts of the Union, will gradually grow to an extent that we become unbearable for our community. When I look through the suggestions the paper put forward, I have to say that I agree with every single one of them. very much so. And many of them are projects that we were trying to push and advocate for in the European Parliament as well. And I was very sorry to learn over in this past 2 years that it is still an ongoing struggle to protect our European money, to protect our European values. I want to give you a bit of a context on how it looks like in the practice and why am I so determined to fight this fight. I'm from Hungary. It's a country which longed to become a part of the Western community for many, many years. We are still one of the most pro-European communities in the entire Union. European funding is a great source of wealth in the country in general. It's a very important source for us. However, when people open the news, very often the first thing they see is a corruption scandal, a grand one, about hundreds of thousands of euros going to the pockets of the son-in-law of Viktor Orban, or European funds being allocated to a summer camp for poor children, which ended up to be a lavish mansion in the hands of the Fidesz mayor's son. And in the same time, these voters also see that their democracy is being destroyed around them, that the independence of the media, the independence of the judiciary is being rolled back, that the Hungarian prosecution is not taking action despite very direct signals coming from Olaf, for instance, or other European bodies that there are problems, only because he is politically connected, only because he is a former member of the ruling Fidesz party. No high-level prosecution case was closed in Hungary in the past decade. So in this context, these voters, these pro-European voters who like the EU in general, who want to become in the core, want to belong to the core of the European Union, they very often ask this question to themselves: why do they keep on financing those who destroy democracy in my country? Do they not see the problems, or do they not want to see the problems? And slowly and surely, this process is eroding trust in the European Union. And meanwhile, the effects that we see all across the continent are huge. Because right now it's not a Hungary and Poland problem anymore. Democratic backsliding is spreading. You mentioned quite a lot of countries, Slovenia, also Bulgaria. And if there is not a forceful and systemic response from the Union side, we will see more and more countries who are inspired by these proceedings in Hungary and just adopt the idea, and eventually it can lead to the disintegration of the Union. So what we were trying to push for is, first of all, to make the European Union use its existing mechanisms better. So such as infringements, or such as other court proceedings, which are launched very rarely. The processes are very slow, and very often the situation cannot be remedied because it's way past when the ruling arrives, such as when the CEU ruling was made, like the Central European University was already in Vienna. The second thing is that we want to see a stronger connection between European money and European funds, European values, and part of this framework is the rule of law mechanism, the conditionality mechanism, which is a groundbreaking instrument. And this is a great pity that it's not being utilized properly. This mechanism is supposed to be union law since January the 1st, and the Commission is well, still hesitating over its use, and the Parliament is determined to fight out this battle in court. And the third is that we need new instruments. For me, one of my personal missions is to create a functioning European blacklist. Right now, I mentioned the case of Mr. Tibor, the son-in-law of Viktor Orban, who was previously found guilty by Olaf of defrauding the Union, and he still keeps on winning European funds. We have an instrument called EDES, which is a blacklisting system. I think it has 6 or 7 companies on it. Maybe Karl knows it better, but it's like in the whole Union, 6 or 7, none of them from the Central Eastern European region. And oh, by the way, it doesn't cover funds in shared management, which constitutes like 80% of European funding. So I really want to push for a functioning European blacklist, a stronger and more powerful European prosecutor office, and with a larger mandate to be able to cover every European country eventually. This is an uphill battle, and I'm not saying it's an easy one. I still think that the treaties bind the hands of decision makers way too much, and way too much trust is placed in national authorities. But we have to find an answer. That's what happens. If the national authorities are not working, if they are not willing to uphold the rule of law, what kind of instruments the EU can have to step in this case? And if we cannot do that, then we are looking forward to a very dangerous path we have to walk down. So I will stop here, and I thank you very much once more for the invitation, and looking forward to the questions.
Thank you very much, Katalin, and I'm really happy that you share all my suggestions. But I think there's a point where we disagree, and I will leave it for later to spice up the Q&A a little bit. Now, Michiel, if you want to give us your preliminary thoughts about this discussion.
Sure. Thank you very much, Camino, and first of all, congratulations to you for this report, to CR and OSEPI. I think it's very timely, and thanks for the invitation to speak. There are 3 points I would like to make in the discussion. One is on why fighting corruption is relevant and important. The second on the need for a consistent approach by the EU institutions. And third on the need for strong and effective institutions to tackle the issue. And I want to start the first point by looking at the Global Corruption Barometer, which Transparency International published last month, and which you may have seen, in which we surveyed 40,000 people across the EU. And that survey revealed that almost 1/3 of people in the EU think that corruption is getting worse in their country. That's something that is got worse during the COVID epidemic. 3 in 10 EU residents say that they directly experience corruption. 29% of people say they paid a bribe or used a personal connection to access public services. Almost 2/3 of people think that government corruption is a problem in their country. And only around 4 in 10 people across the EU think that their governments have handled the pandemic in a transparent manner. Now, as this survey, as well as other surveys show, corruption has a corrosive effect on public trust in government and in the rule of law. And as your report points out, that comes at a high economic cost. So there's a strong incentive for politicians and for society as a whole to tackle corruption. But during the pandemic, we've actually seen a movement in the opposite direction, with transparency and accountability being sacrificed on the altar of expediency. And the result, as we've seen, is a big increase in cases of corruption across the EU. So what do we need? First of all, I think we need a consistent and principled approach by the EU institutions. If we want to tackle public sector corruption effectively, then we need to make sure that policy and decision-making is fully transparent and consultative. We need to enable citizens to monitor public sector activities, to hold governments to account. We need to protect those reporting corruption, like whistleblowers, through the Whistleblower Protection Directive. We need to defend civil society and journalists to expose corruption. We need to safeguard against undue influence in politics, and we need to make sure that those who are guilty of abuse of power are held to account. And that applies at the national level, but it also applies at the EU level. And here, I think the EU institutions are sending very mixed messages, because on the one hand, they call for a tough approach when it comes to tackling corruption, and at the same time, they fail to lead by example. To give you one example, the EU political parties continue to condone member parties that are corrupt and undermine the rule of law at home. Because the most prominent example has been Hungary and Orban, but he's not the only one, and Hungary is not the only one. Fidesz is not the only party. Across the political spectrum, there are problems with EU political parties condoning corrupt parties within their ranks. And that impacts their behavior in the institutions. It impacts the way they vote in the European Parliament. It undermines an effective EU policy against corruption. And I think there's a need for introspection by political parties when it comes to this issue. The second is that the EU institutions themselves are still failing to adhere to the highest standards of public integrity. If you think about the revolving doors at the European Commission, which is hardly policed, senior staff going over to the private sector, taking their information and their networks with them, or if you look at the secrecy of COVID contracts, the vaccine contracts, or the lack of transparency of online lobby meetings during the pandemic, or at the European Parliament, where there is an almost total failure to sanction breaches of ethics rules by its own members. And now we see that as the Parliament is discussing the proposal to set up an independent EU ethics body, the proposal is being watered down to such an extent that it becomes almost meaningless. And this just underlines once again the inability of the EU institutions to police themselves. And if they can't police themselves, how can we expect them to be effective in adopting effective anti-corruption policies for the rest of us? And it also expresses itself in the political culture. And to give you one example, when Sylvie Goulard was nominated by the French government to become the French commissioner, and the European Parliament questioned her integrity, there was immediately a big defense. Lots of people in Brussels, senior people in the think tank world, from civil society, from academia, got together, wrote an open letter defending her against this scrutiny of her political integrity. And as long as that political culture of one rule for them, one rule for us prevails, it's going to be very hard to do anything that's effective. And the third point I was going to mention is the new regulation on rule of law conditionality, which has been mentioned already a few times here, obviously because it's so important, where basically the decision was taken to sacrifice our principles of rule of law for the sake of short-term political expediency and those funds being released. And if the EU institutions want to lead the fight against corruption, then they have to start by setting the right example. Rule of law needs to be more than just a talking point. And the third point I want to make is that we need strong and effective institutions. The EU must put its money where its mouth is. Putting in place entities such as OLAF and the EPPO by itself is not enough. They need to be able to carry out their roles effectively. And that means having sufficient resources to carry out their tasks in an independent and expeditious manner, and also making sure that their investigations lead to prosecutions and convictions. Because if all we have is a pile of reports piling up, then that's not going to help much in reaching our overall objective. The same goes for the proposed new anti-money laundering authority, which we very much welcome as a concept, but which will only be effective if it's autonomous with its own power and its own staff. There's no point putting these bodies in place if those guilty of fraud and corruption can continue their activities without a real threat of conviction. And member states who actively frustrate the work of these bodies should be held to account and be made to pay a price. For too long, member states have been getting away with murder, sometimes literally, and it's time to finally put a stop to that and for the EU to develop some backbone. And this also applies, we shouldn't forget, to corruption in third countries. The EU needs to step up its efforts to fight corruption everywhere and not just turn a blind eye when it suits its short-term interests. So, for instance, we need a strong new global framework, but also an EU framework for asset recovery, stolen funds from third countries to be returned to victim populations. And we need to include corruption in the scope of the EU's new Magnitsky Act. So those are just some reflections on where we stand today and what we need to do. We're taking small steps in the right direction, but as your paper also points out, Camino, there's a long way to go. And I'll stop there.
Thank you, Michiel. I think these are a number of very forceful suggestions, and I'm not sure everybody in the Schumann roundabout will agree with them. So thanks for that, because that instills a sense of debate as well in this conversation that is not only about, preaching to the choir. But I think again, as with Katalin, I think there are some things I agree with and some things I disagree with. So let's kick that off during the Q&A after we hear Carl's opinions, which I'm sure are going to be equally forceful.
Well, thank you, Camino. I hope I won't disappoint. But thank you, first of all, for the invitation to be here today. Thank you also for the title of Pope of Anti-Corruption that you gave to all of us. That's a first, I have to say. But I renounce any doctrine of infallibility, at least for the purposes of the remarks that are about to come. So in my remarks, I'm going to be short and a bit telegraphic. And we can expand upon all of these in the discussion, of course, but I want to focus on how the RRF, how Next Generation EU, how the Recovery Fund has been a missed opportunity for the EU's anti-corruption policies and objectives. This is not about any conditionality that could have been attached to the Recovery Fund, either for anti-corruption or rule of law objectives or linking it to values. Katalin, I think, has covered that ground very, very well, and of course we support this wholeheartedly. That has to happen. Nor is what I'm about to say about the kinds of anti-corruption controls that should be put in place at national level for the 750 billion that will have to be spent in double quick time with, of necessity, I would say, large amounts of political discretion. I'm not sure there is too much to say about this, apart from the fact that national administrations have a very poor track record of putting in place those kinds of effective controls. And the Commission has an even worse record of enforcing it. And all the signs this time point to even more simplified checks and even worryingly simplified public procurement procedures in the rush to get the money out the door. So rather, I want to point to the missed opportunity for the EU to address some of the main drawbacks, some of which is outlined in your paper, Camino, some of the main drawbacks of its current anti-corruption policy. And to summarize, it's too piecemeal, it's too slow, and it's too reliant on what some might call a Potemkin village of paper reforms and ineffective institutions. So I think it's now clear that the RRF, the Recovery Fund, is not Europe's fiscal stimulus in response to the pandemic. It is much too little and too late for that. Rather, it aims to be a once-in-a-generation structural reform package with financial boosters. And the trouble is that when it comes to corruption, member states with entrenched problems, and there are many of them in the EU, and vested interests have no incentive to reform. I was struck by one very telling passage in Camino's paper, which referenced the fate of the Commission's Structural Reform Support Service, which aimed to provide technical support and financial assistance to member states on request for, among other things, anti-corruption and anti-money laundering reforms. Now that unfortunate institution was wound up in 2019 without having received a single request from member states. So that will tell you about the sort of internal dynamics there. In member states which rank very low on Transparency International's Corruption Perceptions Index, such as Hungary, Bulgaria, and Romania, these countries are stuck in a low self-reinforcing equilibrium where gaining and retaining political power relies on patronage networks and opportunities that corruption provides, and where the kind of collective resolve, the kind of collective action necessary to push for reform has in many cases atrophied through a combination of disengagement, cynicism, and a lack of trust in the very public institutions that are there to defend citizens. That's not to mention, in addition to all of that, persistent government-sponsored attacks on civil society. Most recently, we're seeing that in Slovenia, taking a leaf out of the Orban playbook. And as an additional problem, brain drain, right, with people simply voting with their feet and leaving these countries in droves. So all of this contributes to this low equilibrium these countries have found themselves in. Now, solving this kind of problem, solving this kind of collection action problem is not easy. And some have suggested that the only way is a kind of big bang approach, a massive and holistic reform of the entire governance system that also engages large sections of society in that process. Now, this may seem like a pipe dream, but historians of corruption have pointed to the example of Sweden, difficult as it might be to imagine now, right? So in a sustained 20-year period, there were reforms in Sweden in the mid-19th century that converted what was then widely regarded as the most corrupt country in Europe into the poster boy for good governance that it is today. Now, the question, the 750 million euro question is, could the Recovery Fund have been this big bang for governance reform? Could it still be? And what would it have needed to do? And I think, first of all, it would have had to recognize that some of the most effective ways to combat corruption are not really part of the conventional anti-corruption toolkit. For example, better conflict of interest policies or making public procurement more transparent. All of that is important and it has to happen, but it's not enough in itself. So Camino mentioned some of, very, very briefly mentioned some of the elements of what would be a more comprehensive, more holistic anti-corruption package. And I just want to expand on those, maybe using four of what I think are the most important examples that would make a huge difference. So the first is we need to have a more meritocratic public service across Europe. There was a survey conducted a number of years ago of 18,000 public servants across Europe, and they found that corruption was much lower in regions where bureaucrats do not depend on political connections for their livelihoods and for their job security. And I think all too frequently in member states, we see this scenario where on the day after the election, vast swaths of the public service are replaced by cronies and apparatchiks of political party, the winning political party, and that has to stop. The second area, gender equality. Now, research has shown that there are high levels of corruption in regions where there is a low proportion of women in local council, and that's a very, very stable conclusion, controlling for lots of factors. So quite simply, more women in politics is linked to better quality of government. We need to put much more emphasis on this. A third issue, rural broadband connectivity. Okay, sounds like a technical fix, but what we know is that access to information and reducing the informal elements of contact with public services, corrupt officials, are proven factors in reducing corruption and bribery. And this should be a priority in highly corrupt countries that are also those countries that suffer most from the digital divide. Now, it is not an accident, I think, that startups and entrepreneurs in those countries tend to cluster around the national capitals, much more so in less than in less corrupt countries, because those capitals have better governance, and indeed the political climate tends to be more favorable. So you get the situation where we have a very authoritarian governments in power in many corrupt countries, but in the capital cities you have relatively benign and much better run administrations. The last one, go green. We need to invest massively, not only in environmental objectives and policies and outcomes, but we need to invest massively in public engagement with environmental reforms. Now, there is ample research from Transparency International and others going back decades that environmental corruption and negative environmental outcomes are most prevalent in countries where transparency is low and governance structures are weak. There are plenty of examples recently where environmental activism has energized communities, so have got them away from that apathy and disengagement that I talked about earlier. That apathy and disengagement is actually very much reflected in the results of the Global Corruption Barometer that Gio mentioned, right? That this widespread corruption turns people off engaging with public policy. But on environmental issues, there's a track record of engaging people on this. Most recently in Slovenia at the weekend, where a referendum on environmental planning laws produced record turnouts for a referendum, and especially amongst the young. So both the recovery funds and the European Green Deal should prioritize public engagement in the form of citizens' assemblies and citizen monitoring panels, which would stimulate the appetite for governance reforms more generally, and perhaps see a reawakening of that democratic practice that usually is the first and most fatal victim of systemic corruption. So my conclusion, maybe something I would offer up for discussion really, is that tackling the problem of corruption and what it means for our democracies is too important to be left just to anti-corruption policy. Thanks.
Thank you, Carl, and thanks so much for putting some flesh into my very brief comment on doing something more than like going at it with sanctions and laws alone, because indeed like we sort of need something that I hate how it sounds, but it's actually really true. A bottom-up approach to fighting corruption is necessary if we're going to do something about it. Now, Katalin has to leave at 1 p.m. sharp, Brussels time, and I see her actually, taking probably the departure panel because it's in an airport. So thanks so much, Katalin, again for having made it to this event today. So I will open the Q&A with a question to Katalin, and I would ask you if you do have questions for her, since we only have her for like 10 more minutes. Now is the time to raise your hand or write a question in the chat, and then we'll sort of restart the Q&A with Carl, Michiel, and myself after that. So Katalin, you're a fierce defender of the rule of law conditionality mechanism, which we've been talking about it a lot during the event. And just for some background, this is a regulation that was approved in November 2020 with the opposition of Hungary and Poland, which says that countries with systemic rule of law problems will not receive EU funds until they resolve these problems. This is basically a long story short. Now, in December 2020, both Budapest and Warsaw sort of threatened to veto the European Union's own resources ceiling decision, which sounds very techy, but it's basically the thing that allows the European Union, the thing that allowed the European Union to actually go to the markets to raise money for the recovery funds, with the effect that if the veto would have gone forward, then the whole recovery funds would have been blocked. And remember that we're talking about December 2020, vaccines were not yet there, and this was a very hot and intense political question. Now, the European Council broke a compromise, obviously crafted by Chancellor Merkel herself, which basically said, okay, guys, if you drop your veto, we will suspend the conditionality mechanism until or if and until there is an ECJ decision on it. Now, Budapest and Warsaw launched a ECJ procedure on the 11th of March this year, and as of now, the conditionality mechanism is suspended. So now, Katalin, you mentioned the Parliament is going to go to court to ask the Commission to sort of like start using the conditionality mechanism ASAP. And I am of the opinion that this political decision had some merits because balance against suspending the whole, blocking the whole recovery funds, and thinking that the ECJ would actually resolve, hopefully, in the Commission's sort of favor, it kind of, makes some sense. But you disagree with that, and I would like to know why.
Thank you. We could argue about the fact that whether it was a useful compromise or was it a good compromise. My argument is not about that. This rule of law conditionality mechanism is union law since January 1. And then the Council conclusions are not part of the European legislative framework. I believe that you cannot really start defending the rule of law by breaking the rule of law at the first place. The fact that the Commission is not applying this mechanism, is voluntarily suspending it until the court delivers its ruling, it's just fundamentally wrong, and it's a breach of union law. And this is my main problem with this issue. Basically, they are once again giving some months of leeway for governments who never acted in favor of the general main European interest, who wanted to veto the entire European recovery package. They are just giving a free ride to Mr. Orbán ahead of the elections. If the recovery funds are being disbursed, basically this lack of control and this never-ending legal battle could just very well end in a place where nothing is applied before the next Hungarian elections at April. And we know from history that Mr. Orbán uses the European funds for political leverage. Opposition-led cities very often receive much less or even zero support when cronies and loyal leaders profit much more. And we haven't spoken about his family members and the oligarchs who sustain the system. So basically, for me, putting the mechanism on hold means that whoever agrees to that endorses the system we have in place. And the Parliament fights for upholding the rule of law, both in member states, but also within the union bodies. We heard very good signals from the Commission that they will move forward in autumn by the application of the mechanism, which I very much like, but this is not something I have to applaud them. This is their job, this is union law, and if the Commission is not delivering on that, then indeed the Parliament will go to court.
Thank you, Katalin. I think that perhaps we can have a subsequent discussion in person about this kind of issues, because I do have a question for you in the chat from my colleague John Springford, who is probably somewhere where there's a lot of drilling going on. Hence, he's asking his question in the chat. Michiel mentioned that European political parties tolerate corrupt and authoritarian members parties. In the case of Fidesz and the EPP, this was clearly a strategic decision by Merkel and other conservative leaders to keep Fidesz in the tent, perhaps to maximize influence or to minimize the risk of backlash either by Hungarian politicians or voters. What is your view on what their strategy was, and perhaps you could explain why they were wrong?
The European People's Party have been following a strategy which basically entailed the will to appease Mr. Orban, to appease authoritarian tendencies, and thus trying to prevent further backsliding. This strategy was clearly not working. All the red lines that were drawn by Manfred Weber were just very easily swept aside by Mr. Orban, and frankly, I believe it's a shame for the centrist conservative political family having tolerated these kind of anti-European, anti-democratic, and corrupted behavior within their ranks for so long. This was, of course, in one hand, the strategy of appeasement, as I said, but on the other hand, very severe business interests played part, I believe. The German industry has a very important base in Hungary, and I believe that the economic cooperation was sometimes a key for the leaders looking at the other direction when things went wrong in the democracy end. But I think what was a mistake here is that I believe that a stable business environment could never foster in a country where the rule of law is not being upheld, where the economy is not predictable, where you cannot count on the independence of the judiciary, or just on the very simple fact that if you are doing your business right, then nobody will try to push you out of the market with the backing of the government. I, of course, welcome the decision that Fidesz is not a member of the EPP anymore, but this decision came way too late, and this really points beyond the situation between Mrs. Merkel and Mr. Orban, but like rather a more general question whether was the right way of dealing with people guilty of democratic backsliding. In my opinion, appeasement is not an option, and we have to draw hard lines when such mistakes are being encountered within the Union. And with this, I have to say goodbye to you. I am very glad having the possibility to talk to you today, and I'm very much looking forward to future similar conversations on this topic. And I do apologize, but I have a flight to catch.
Thank you very much, Katalin, and have a good flight.
Thank you.
Bye to you. Bye. Right. So let's go to the other disagreements that we might have in this discussion. Michiel, you talked about strong institutions, right? And obviously, you had Transparency International EU, which works to improve anti-corruption measures in the bloc and also to widen public support for them. You yourself have been a strong advocate of strong institutions, and you mentioned some ideas. So these can forcefully and efficiently apply anti-graft measures. You and I, we both talked about anti-money laundering before, but I think we have different approaches on this, because what I suggest in my paper, and I guess that's also partially a think tank alliance, if you want, so to speak, since SEPS is also obviously of this idea, is instead of going sort of full-fledged with a new agency to monitor money laundering in the European Union, why not first begin with the European Banking Authority? I know that there has been a lot of doubts over its role during the sort of the Baltic scandal, but at the same time, doesn't it make sense to start from there and then see what this gives before going to a fully fledged agency that you yourself said will need resources and all these sort of things? So what is your view on that? What is your take on that?
Sure. Let me just come back, if I may, to one point that that you discussed with Katalin before I answer that point about the rule of law, because I think we're often sort of presented with decisions as though there's a black and white choice between two options, and if we don't choose one, then sort of everything is lost. And it's a little bit like that with the rule of law discussion, I think, because it was very much framed as we need to move on, or we need to adopt this recovery fund package, otherwise member states won't get the money they need to rebuild their economies. And so we're prepared to sort of put our concerns about how effectively these funds are spent on the back burner. And the reasoning behind that is very understandable, of course, and we've talked about that. The danger is that if you keep accepting that logic, then of course there will never be a time when fighting corruption and fighting fraud is the most important issue, because there will always be considerations that in the general scheme of things are more important than fighting corruption and fighting fraud. And if you keep doing that on a consistent basis, then the end result will be that you are undermining the structures and the institutions and the policies of the union, and reduce support for the work that it does. And so that's one consideration. The second is that the EU could probably have called these countries bluff if it had wanted to, and still get the fund that it wanted, as well as strict rules on conditionality. I mean, if you think back to the fact that the EU was prepared to set up a whole new treaty to overcome a UK veto on the fiscal compact, then it doesn't take much imagination to think that the EU, if this had been such an existential issue for the Union, would also have found a way to circumvent a veto by Hungary and Poland on the recovery fund. And so I think they should have called their bluff, and they should have moved ahead and stuck to their guns on this issue. And I think we still would have got the recovery fund. On the whole completely different question of the anti-money laundering authority, I'm glad we're in agreement that there's a need to have a supervisory capability at EU level, because what we see at the moment is that it's member states are all implementing EU rules independently of each other at the national level, and it's not moving fast enough. I mean, the latest the requirements imposed by the fifth anti-money laundering directive have only been fully implemented by, I think, 5 member states, when the time for that to happen has already passed. And there's clearly a lack of urgency, a lack of ambition that is holding countries back. And one of the reasons is that there's a lack of pressure from Brussels to act. And I think setting up a pan-EU authority would help generate the kind of political pressure, but also the kind of legal pressure to get member states moving. Now, how exactly you do that, of course, is a matter for debate. And I'm not saying that one solution is by definition better than the others. I would be slightly concerned about the European Banking Authority taking on that role, partly for the reason you mentioned, which is that in the case of Danske Bank, it failed to prove that it had an ability to act at an EU level without taking into consideration the interest of its member authorities, partly also because of ethics issues, because as you know, very recently, the former executive director of the EBA went on to become chief lobbyist for the private sector in the same field, and the EBA saw no problem with that particular move. That suggests to me that the organization is certainly not yet equipped to deal with the kind of issues that an AML authority needs to address. And finally, I think there's a more general point, which is that I think for this kind of highly specialist work, which is what it is, you need to put together a team of people who are solely dedicated to this task, who always have their eye on the ball. And there's always a danger that if you make this part of the task of a wider, bigger agency, that it gets snowed under in the priorities of the leadership of that agency, which may or may not focus on those particular issues. So there's a lot more to be said about that, but based on those considerations, I think that an independent authority to deal with high-risk cross-border issues is what we need at the moment.
Thanks, Michiel. I think there is a lot to be discussed about this more techie question of the anti-money laundering agency, indeed. But if I may come back very quickly to the conditionality mechanism, and I know that, I mean, this is not an event about the conditionality mechanism, but it's obviously one of the most politically significant issues that we've gone through over the past months. I think you're right in saying that, you know, the European Union could have called bluff on Hungary and Poland, and there is always a political solution, as we saw with the European Council's legally doubtful decision to actually suspend the regulation, something that the European Council legally has no right to do. I think the counter argument to that, though, would be that the recovery fund itself, and the way it's designed, it's very, I mean, it takes into account previous failures, in my view, of the way the European Union failed to oversee and to monitor expenditure of like other structural funds or cohesion funds or all these sort of things. And it's very conscious of these problems by setting milestones and landmarks. And the way it is organized by having like 6 months reviews and, you know, like having to approve national plans and having to have a constant dialogue with the national authorities as well, I think it takes into account some of these problems. So I think that coupled with Merkel's sort of like sensitivity towards, you know, the Central and Eastern European bloc, if you want, and to try to build bridges instead of like drive more wedges in between the West and the East, I think that's what led to this compromise. And I still think, and I might be an optimistic in this respect, and I know that I don't do any favors to my legal background by saying these things, because obviously, again, this is not a legal sound position. But I still think that, you know, the conditionality mechanism will come into place, you know, in time to avoid problems or major problems with the recovery fund, and that the European Commission is actually really doing a good job already in, you know, holding, for example, Hungary's national plan, and it should obviously be doing more on, for example, pushing Slovenia and other countries. But I think with this argument, if I was an advisor at a very heated, you know, European Council in December, I would have thought, okay, let's, you know, try to do this, and not because I think that, you know, now we don't have the time to talk about corruption. Let's kick the can down the road, just because I think that the mechanism that they put in place for the recovery fund itself was already addressing some of these problems. So that's only my opinion, but again, you know, we can discuss about this. Carl, I think that you and I agree that we can't stop corruption by sanctions or by laws alone, right? And we're seeing this with the Article 7 procedures. We're seeing this also, unfortunately, with the fruitless infringement procedures that the European Commission, the European Union in general is bringing against Hungary and Poland. I'm really curious to see what's going to happen in the coming 3 days with Polish Supreme Court's decisions and also the ECJ decision on Poland and the judiciary. But I think I'm more optimistic than you are about the potential of the European Public Prosecutor's Office, which is ultimately, indeed, a law enforcement body, right? So it does have little room to deal with things like governance and improving, all these very important things that you talk about. What is, in your view, the most important problem that the European Public Prosecutor's Office has, and how can the European Union try to fix it?
Yeah, thanks, Camino. Maybe I just want to echo and support one of the things that Michiel said earlier, which is maybe a necessary prelude to what I'm going to say, which is, that episode of the European Banking Authority where they failed to censure Danske Bank is probably one of the most shameful episodes in the EU's efforts to try and stem anti-corruption or anti-money laundering in recent history, and I think deserves to be better known. And I think the fact that they did not do so is a result of how the institution is set up and the governance of the institution, right? The way that the governing body effectively circled wagons and not force it to a vote, right? So I think, so that just goes to, well, I'm saying that partly because I support what Michiel says, but I also, because I think it's important about how you set up institutions before you can talk about, are they, is this going to be the silver bullet for corruption or not? And clearly, I don't think anybody has any expectations that the public prosecutor is going to be a silver bullet. The question is how effective it will be. I mean, rather than talking in abstract about governance structures, I mean, let's take a concrete example, right? I mean, in terms of the European Public Prosecutor's relationship with Hungary. Now, some people think that Orbán has, very neatly sidestepped a problem by refusing to join the European Public Prosecutor's Office, but actually it's just delayed, I think, some of the collisions that are going to happen over the next couple of years when that institution is up and running, because even though it hasn't formally joined, there would be no national delegated prosecutor in Budapest. The jurisdiction of the European Public Prosecutor runs to Hungarian citizens who are implicated in crimes outside of Hungary's borders, right? And also it runs to jurisdiction over citizens of participating member states that may be in the crime, where the crime may have been committed. So you can imagine all kinds of jurisdictional clashes that will be coming up, and maybe even the possibility that, not an unlikely possibility that some Hungarian citizen who's very close to Orbán that they might rush to prosecute his case first before the public prosecutor gets there, so that then have the case dismissed or have the defendant absolved or in some other way to prevent double jeopardy. So that is just to say that there is going to be, I think, further clashes down the road between the EPPO and the Hungarian government. But it has been suggested that probably rather than do all of this and face all of this, it might have been smarter for the Hungarian government to join in the first place and do what Orbán has been systematically doing with the rest of the European institutions, which is subvert and undermine it from within. And you asked me, what are the things that are wrong with the current setup? And people get very excited about the public prosecutor because it sounds like, oh, it's the European FBI. We're going to gangbusters are going to go in and solve crimes in countries. But it's a system where you have people who are basically national prosecutors that are then attached to this European federal body. And there are two things about that system which make it easy to undermine. First, they will be totally reliant on the national law enforcement authorities in terms of evidence gathering, and indeed even in some cases in screening witnesses and things like that. And then secondly, it doesn't entirely reduce the risk of conflict of interest, because quite simply, even though some national prosecutors in Budapest or Warsaw or elsewhere may, not in Warsaw, but in other countries that were maybe temporarily attached to the European Public Prosecutor, they still have careers in those countries as prosecutors, potentially as judges, potentially as lawyers elsewhere. And so their career prospects will depend on how they are seen within the national framework. No matter that for a temporary period of time, they are answerable to this federal body. And I think those kind of conflicts of interest and the kind of pressures that can be brought to bear on delegated prosecutors won't go away, and in fact are a feature, I would say, rather than a bug in this system that's been set up. So so I have some sympathy with that. I don't want to give Orban any free advice, but rather than face repeated calls that he can't have any funding unless he joins the public prosecutor, it's probably better if he joined the public prosecutor and then used his cronies in law enforcement and the judiciary to make sure that it doesn't operate properly. How much that would happen in other countries, of course, I think is a good point and something for.
Thank you, Carl. I think the challenges for the European public prosecutor are many. And to be perfectly frank with all of you, I was not a big supporter of the idea before the whole pandemic happened, because I thought, why having another body like that, sort of, trying to achieve the goal of being not perhaps a European FBI, but more of a sort of European supranational criminal law body, when there is no European criminal law and when you don't have any plans to abolish Olaf in the first place. So I was very skeptical about this, and I often compare it with the building of the Eurozone, right? So where the European Union sort of puts the horses before the carts. But now with the recovery funds and the need of having an extra layer of overseeing and monitoring of what countries are doing with the money, and also to be able to act in cases where the judiciary or national authorities in general are actually capture, I think that's something like the EPPO was always going to be necessary. So if it wasn't there, we would have need to invent it, and it would have taken a lot of time, much more than what we have at the moment. So anyway, I stopped my rant about the European public prosecutor, and I will ask you a question from the chat. John Springford, he's interested in the panel's views on the question of why appeasement has been the strategy so far from political leaders rather than raising the stakes. Is it habitual? Is it a fear of causing instability? Is it the risk of veto or the need to keep leaders on site so they have support in other areas? So perhaps, Michiel, you have been a politician yourself, so maybe you can have a go at that.
Sure, it's not an easy question. I mean, I was just reflecting on the fact actually that when I became a member of the European Parliament in 1999, there was already discussion then about setting up a European public prosecutor. So the idea has certainly been around for a long time, and I think that just to take this back slightly to the discussion we had about the European Banking Authority, maybe one of the reasons why there was now the support to set up the EPPO has been the fact that it was shown that relying solely on Olaf and then national prosecuting authorities taking over Olaf investigations and building a prosecution case just wasn't working effectively, and you needed an engine, a central engine at the EU level to make sure that there's the pressure to do this, but also the mechanisms to make sure that there is a smooth transition from an investigation into a prosecution. And the new setup may not yet be entirely smooth, but at least it's smoother than, at least on paper, than what we had before. I mean, on the question of the appeasement, yes, I mean, I think it's probably a combination of those factors. I mean, things like the non-interference principle probably tends to play a role. If I don't interfere in your problems, you're not going to interfere in mine, which can always come in handy at some point. It's about short-term expediency. It's getting things done and not wanting to overcomplicate things which you don't need to necessarily overcomplicate things with. I mean, one other example from which I always find interesting in this respect is the fact that a lot of politicians speak out against having 2 seats for the European Parliament in Strasbourg, in Brussels and Strasbourg, including Merkel at one point. And so you kind of think, well, there's a lot of support for dealing with this and tackling it in the treaty. But of course, when the treaty negotiations come up, member states focus on what is really important to them, and then a question like the seat of the parliament is completely secondary, if not tertiary, and they don't talk about it anymore. And so absolutely, it has to do with national priorities. But I think so there's those sort of obvious explanations, but I think there is also an underestimation of the long-term impact of not acting in these areas. And politicians, I think, forget that there is a link between public trust in institutions and the way those institutions function. And we see that in our corruption barometers, our corruption perceptions index, that corrupt governments tend to have lower levels of trust. And the EU is not exempted from this. But this is not something that I think is sufficiently taken into account. The need to build and maintain public support for the EU's work tends to be, sort of seen by national governments as only a factor of how a national government does in Brussels, and not in terms of the overall policies of the EU and how the government helps shape them. So I think that plays a role as well. And then finally, I would say, there's political loyalty. There's the European party families, the point that I mentioned, and there is no question, I think, that having this structure of European party families, which have a large degree of large amount of influence, increasing amount of influence actually in the way politics happens in Brussels on a daily basis, also changes the dynamics, because political leaders are even less willing to drop someone of their own political family than they are to drop a peer in general. So I think those factors all come together. And I was reflecting this morning on the fact that it's one of the paradoxes of the increased power of the European Parliament, that it's increasingly important for political families to be the largest party, or to be large enough to secure a number of jobs inside the Parliament, committee chairs, etc. And the only way to do that is to have votes. And those votes, you take from parties that are completely above board and uphold the highest standards of integrity. But if you need to take them from parties that don't necessarily adhere to those standards, well, you're willing to ignore that, because they will help you get a majority, get a committee chair, and so it's in your own short-term interest to do that. And as long as there's not a political culture that says that you cannot do that, that's unacceptable, that will continue. With the Orban development, I think there's been a change, and let's hope that this is a start of something, of a development in which these political parties and their leaders are no longer protected, but to a large extent they still are.
And Michiel, what's your view, Carl, on the question of appeasement?
Well, I think I agree with what Michiel said. I'll just add two points to that, right, which are ideology and business. Now, I mean, it's not just a question of appeasing this, cancerous growth in the body politic of European politics, right? There have been strong links that go back decades between politicians in Germany, for example, in what would have been at one point the mainstream right, in the CSU and the CDU, and Orban, right? And that those links are some of them are personal, but there's no doubt some of them are based on similar ideology around things like migration, family values, and what might be termed a kind of a sort of hard right agenda. And this is Fidesz is just an example, perhaps, or it was an example of what maybe some in the CDU and some in the CSU would have liked, their party to travel in that direction as well, right? So that's important to bear in mind. It's not just there's a very Merkelian sort of approach to compromise and status quo and muddling through, right? But there is also ideology behind this. And the second is business, right? I mean, I think probably the most well-known aspect of that is the fact that the Hungarian economy and the German car industry have a kind of a symbiosis that is going on, right? The Hungarian economy benefits, I think, even more than it does from EU funds, from the investments of German car manufacturers and the associated supply chains, which are also based in Hungary. And in return, those car plants get very generous subsidies from the Hungarian government. It seems peculiar strategy, actually, I would say, and a short-sighted strategy in part of Germany, which is to basically sell the rule of law down the river for the future of an industry, which is actually now probably going to have to be wound up if Germany is going to leave its very ambitious 2030 commitments. And we'll see with the Fit for 55 package, how much of these kind of state-sponsored investments can last. But that is effectively what's happened, I think. And then it's not just the car industry. And maybe a little known fact is that the biggest purchaser of German arms exports is the Hungarian government. And so this is something, I think last year 1.7 billion worth of arms was purchased by the Hungarian government from German manufacturers. So let's not neglect these kind of more earthy elements of the relationship as well. Maybe the last point is that it sort of reminds me of something that was touched upon briefly in your paper, Camino, which is that the usual view is that corruption is bad for business, right? But it's also true that businesses can thrive in a highly corrupt but highly predictable environment, right? If you know consistently what the government is going to do, then it may not be so bad for business. And I think that to some extent, that's what you have in Hungary, and maybe some other member states are approaching that as well.
Thanks, Carl. Right, so I don't think I see any more hands raised or any more questions. So we've got 6 minutes left, and I would like to raise a final question, something which is a rather complex development of this whole topic that we've been discussing. We talked before about the judiciary, right, and the judges, and how they are the last line of defense and how they've been under attack. And I want to point out that this event and this paper and the whole conversation is not only about Poland or Hungary or the Central and European and Eastern European countries at all. There are problems everywhere. And there is a very scary worrying tendency that I think we should all be aware of, which I call the rise of the Eurosceptic courts. We're seeing rulings from many member states on the primacy of EU law, sort of disputing the supremacy of European Union law over national law. And of course, that can be a good thing if you are sort of a Eurosceptic or Eurocritic, or if you are a pro-sovereign person. But that can be a very bad thing if we are talking about governments sort of like passing constitutions and laws which are clearly not complying with the rule of law, like happens in some member states. But let me give you a couple of examples of something that is worrying me increasingly. For example, the recent ruling of the French Conseil d'État on the primacy of French security law over European Court of Justice rulings, because there's not such a thing as a European security legal acquis. Also, the German Constitutional Court's ruling on the PPE and the sort of the ultra vires famous decision of the ECJ declaring that the court had gone like overboards. And now we are waiting for 2 rulings from Poland's Supreme Court on the same kind of question. And obviously, when we're talking about France and Germany, this is more of an academic discussion. When we're talking about Poland and Hungary, it becomes a political discussion. My own country, Spain, there's been a lot of questioning about the independence of the judiciary coming from the government itself, and also the Catalan independence movement. So it's something that is also close to my own interest. And my question is, going forward, since Katalin was talking about the potential that this topic has for disintegration of the European Union, going forward, 5 years from now, where do you see the European Union and the European legal order being? I know it's a tricky question, and I know it deviates a little bit from the corruption hardcore thing, but I think it's something that should be on everybody's radar and that we should be, closely following, because it does have the potential of being a very disruptive force. Carl?
Thanks. Yeah, this is very. I mean, very briefly, just to allow time for us to come in. I think we need to just tackle two questions here, right? One is the question of what to do about the judiciary, which is clearly not independent, is maybe corrupt in some countries. So there are different forms of this problem, right? I think the problem in Hungary is very much the judiciary, the National Judicial Council is in the pockets of the ruling party. In other countries, in the European Union. In Bulgaria, for example, they're prone to corruption, and there are issues that are. Then there's a separate issue, which is differing views about the European constitutional order, right? I think whatever you would say about the Karlsruhe judgment, I mean, you wouldn't say it was a product of a lack of independence or political interference or corruption or anything like that. And this is a kind of a dialogue that's been going on at least in German constitutional circles for 20, 30 years. But I agree with you that this is probably one of the most fundamental questions for the EU going forward, about because increasingly the primacy of the institutions is being challenged legally and politically, right? Because I think that is also, you saw the statement from the 19 parties that were far right extreme parties who want to sign a common statement ahead of the Conference of the Future of Europe, and basically the idea is how can we make sure that we tame the European Union and make it a servant of national interests, right? So I think this is actually a broader agenda, some of it being pursued through political means, some of it through legal means.
Thanks. Michiel?
Well, as Carl said, it's a big question, as you yourself said as well. I mean, one thing that's clear is that the EU is based on a legal order, and if that legal order is questioned by its component parts, then the EU is in trouble. So the EU will have no choice but to address this in one way or the other. If for instance, in Poland, the Constitutional Court there takes the kind of decision that has been trailed as one that it might potentially take. On the broader point of judicial independence, I think what is absolutely critical is for the political class, for political leaders, to stand up for judicial independence. And it's been way too tempting for politicians across the EU to jump into debates about issues that are either before the courts or where the court has decided, and to strongly disagree with the courts, to accuse them of political bias, and that only serves to undermine the independence of the courts. I mean, the UK is now left, but if you remember the discussion about all the Brexit discussions and how the members of the Supreme Court were portrayed there by the media as national traitors. I mean, that kind of narrative contributes to a climate in which people no longer respect the judiciary and may even be open to attacking it. In the Netherlands, we've seen a lawyer being murdered who was part of a criminal trial, and now a journalist just recently. And of course, you can't always prevent these things happening, but one thing that you need as a precondition is for politicians, political parties, civil society to stand up for this independent judiciary, to defend it, no matter what the decisions it takes, as something that is critical to the rule of law in our country and to the stability of our society. And yeah, there's been too little of that recently, and maybe these incidents in Netherlands, elsewhere, will serve as a wake-up call to politicians when it comes to the need to do that.
Absolutely. I think, as I said before, defending the rule of law will be one of the EU's most pressing tasks in the years to come, but also standing up for the judiciary. I think I've emphasized it enough, because as you say, when governments and the media are portraying the judiciary as enemies of the people, then there is not much you can do to stop populism, right-wing parties from taking that narrative and go ahead with it. Well, anyway, thank you very much. Our time is over. Thanks a lot to both of you for not only having agreed to speak about corruption and rule of law again in a July afternoon, where you probably would have preferred to be at the beach, even if it's not in Brussels, since it's really not nice weather, but also for reading my paper and for helping me conveying the results of this paper. We'll be doing one more paper on this series on the future of European justice and home affairs policies, which will be the final paper, and that will be a big thing, looking at things from migration to the rule of law, to big data, to criminal law itself. And that's going to happen in a few months. But anyway, we at CR will be looking very closely at these developments, both in the judiciary, corruption, the rule of law, conditionality mechanism, and the recovery fund. So stay tuned, and thanks a lot, both Carl and Michiel, for being here today, and to everybody for having tuned in to our event today. Thank you.
Thanks, Camino.
Goodbye.